So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Very happy to open this session, and I'm impressed that so many of you are joining us. Let me just open with a few words of acknowledgement. We are hosted by the Tel Aviv University Next Gen Leadership Global Community Organization and the Tel Aviv University Alumni Organization. So thank you very much to all for inviting us here. And I'm here to discuss this. I hope you can see it. This is the annual report on the state of anti-Semitism in the world that is published by Tel Aviv University on the part of Tel Aviv University. It was published by the Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry with the support of the Adam and Gila Milstein Family Foundation and by the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Human Rights and Justice with the support of Richard and Elaine Dobrowski and Sarah Vered in collaboration with the ADL. I think probably many of you have already read the report or heard about it or read about it. If you haven't, I encourage you to visit our website, cst.tau.ac.il, and you can read the full document, which is 150 pages long. But I think it would give you, if you haven't read it yet, it would give you a nice overview of not just the state of anti-Semitism in the world, but what got us to where we are at the moment. And I guess the bottom line is known to you, even if you haven't read the report and you haven't read about it. And that is that 2023, which is the year analyzed here, was a very bad year. The report, as we mentioned in the introduction, conveys bad news. It is a messenger of bad news. We saw in 2023 unprecedented and extremely alarming numbers of anti-Semitic incidents, with the month from October to December being, for reasons which you all know, being particularly damaging, and seeing really numbers that organizations that are tracking anti-Semitic incidents, the scope of anti-Semitic incidents, have noted that such numbers have never been seen before. What I don't want to do is dwell on the numbers and the distribution, because the bottom line is very clear. I want to cut to the chase and discuss what can be done and why certain things are not done, and what should be our focus and what shouldn't be. And if some of the things I say sound critical, it is because I intend them to be so. That is, I think we have to recognize when we see such numbers, this is not an achievement. This is not something, I mean, because sometimes I get this feeling that the numbers are related to as if we broke some record. That is not a good way to look at it. These numbers indicate a failure. If we had campaigns and organizations and governments and individuals dedicated to fighting, for example, sexual harassment or car accidents, and we'd have almost constantly more of these, then we'd obviously understand their work as a failure. Now, failure could mean one of two things: that they're doing the right things, but not enough, that more should be done. That is one option. The other option, and the two are not really mutually exclusive, is that what they're doing is not in the right direction, that efforts are not invested, or at least some of the efforts are not invested in the right direction. So I think our point of departure has to be, when we are facing this crisis, that the crisis signifies a failure. We are facing a failure. We are facing efforts which are not yielding the desired results, and that is what we want to correct. The objective of combating anti-Semitism is that there would be less of it. I'm saying something that sounds almost self-evident. I mean, do you really need to say that? Well, I do need to say that because one thing we never see are objectives set, goals set, a clear definition of where we want to be in a year from now. Now, whatever project you undertake, unless you set objectives, there is no way to know whether you failed or succeeded. One of my most favorite Jewish jokes is about a guy who lived on a farm and he had hundreds of chickens. And one day the chickens started to die. There was some kind of epidemic. And he went to the rabbi, helpless. And he said, Rabbi, all those chickens are dying. Do you have a way to help me? Do you have an advice? And the rabbi said, yes. It's a Jewish joke. So the rabbi said, yes, give them chicken soup. And more chickens die. So the Jew returns to the rabbi and he tells the rabbi the advice did not help. Do you have another advice? The rabbi says, yes, of course. Give them rice with raisins. Now more chickens die. And the next day he returns to the rabbi and says, well, Rabbi, what should I do? I'm helpless. The rabbi says, pour some cold water on them. More chickens die. And then he returns to the rabbi, says, all the advice did not work. Rabbi, do you have any additional advice? The rabbi answers, advice, I have plentiful more. The question is, how many chickens do you still have? The point is, it's good that I don't see you, so I don't know if people laughed or did not laugh from that joke. But the point is, in the end, advice and efforts, they need to lead to a result. And that's and to a positive result, to an improvement. That is not what we are seeing in recent years. By the way, not everywhere, and I'll say a word about that later. If I try to zoom in on the situation, and rather than discuss it in abstract terms, through slogans, through broad statements, really zoom in and with a hands-on approach and think, what got us to where we are today? Then I think there are two things to consider. One is we have a new factor, one that we did not have 20 years ago or 40 years ago. I'm not convinced that the number of anti-Semites in the world today is far larger than it was 40 years ago. But we do have something we did not have 40 years ago, and 20 years ago, and that's social media. And social media allows people who are evildoers and evil thinkers, it allows them certain advantages that they did not have 20 years ago. One is that they can convey their ideas, they can share their ideas with the world without any editing. 20 years ago, if you were an anti-Semite and you wanted to spread around conspiracy theories or theory or some hateful speech against Jews or against any other community, what were your options? I mean, you could write a pamphlet and maybe circulate it among a small group of friends. You could go around someplace and shout, and maybe people would gather around and listen to you. But if you sent a letter to the editor, and if this was a mainstream normal or even fringe and normal newspaper, you'd be stopped. Your ideas would not pass through. Today, however horrible the idea you have in your mind is, the only thing separating between yourself and potentially billions of people being exposed to it is that you have access to social media. The other thing, the other negative impact of social media is that people who visit certain pages, because of the algorithm system, people who read certain information will then be offered to read similar information. That is, if you already, even accidentally, came to be interested in anti-Semitic or other hateful speech, it's very likely that you will get more of it, even if you didn't ask for it. And the third negative impact of social media is, as you all know, the echo chamber effect, whereby people, because of, again, the algorithm system, people are exposed again and again to ideas which are similar to the ideas that they already have. And this leads them to believe that these ideas are not fringe, but are mainstream, but are normal, because so many people think, they believe, so many people think as they do. So we have social media, and here is the problem. The situation that we have in the world today is that there are big companies that make big money by spreading big lies. And as long as you have big companies making big money from spreading big lies, you will have anti-Semitism thriving, and you will have other forms and kinds of hateful speech thriving. Now, as you all know, fighting big companies that make big money is not easy. But the truth is, if we are serious about combating anti-Semitism, there isn't a way around it. That's what you have to target. You have to create a reality whereby big companies would lose big money if they spread big lies. Now, everyone knows how that can be done. I think there is a general agreement about the legislation that is needed, and there is also agreement about the limitations that would pose on the freedom that is currently exercised in terms of publishing things online, not necessarily in terms of having them stay online. This would mean that editorial discretion would have to be exercised before posts or tweets or whatever are published, are posted, rather than after. I'm not saying it's an easy path. I'm not saying my solution is necessarily the only one possible. There can be variations of that solution. But we can't ignore the problem. If we are serious about fighting anti-Semitism, then the reality in which big companies make big money by spreading big lies, that will have to change. My second point, if we want a zoom-in approach, a hands-on approach, a practical approach, an approach which is directed towards a reality whereby we'll have clear objectives set, and then we can measure at the end of every year whether these were accomplished or not, is that we need to philosophize less. We need to give less big speeches, pompous statements. We need to generalize less. We need to think less of history, and our approach has to be much more targeted. One of the things we learned in our studies is that in the end, there isn't really anti-Semitism as such in the United States, in the Great Britain, in Germany. In the end, there are neighborhoods in each of those countries and other countries. There are neighborhoods. There are cities where you have much more of this, much more from this, and you have those where you have far less. If our approach is going to become an approach that targets a neighborhood, a street, a school, a campus, where you have a lot of that, using both education, this you can say is the carrot, and police work, policing, this you can say is the stick. If you have both of this, you focus on one neighborhood, one city, one campus, one school, where you have a lot of this recorded, I think there we can make a difference. Now, that is, of course, much more difficult because it's no longer about, seminars and talks as the one I'm giving here. It's not about political statements. It's about a local police force, a local educational force doing something which is very targeted, which very much zooms in. But there, maybe we can have results. If you read our report from last year, not this year, but last year's report, one of the things we found is that if you look at New York City and London, the vast majority of anti-Semitic incidents took place in specific locations, and those targeted were mainly, not only, but predominantly ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredim. Now, if your approach is that is your focus, those areas, protecting those populations, then I think you'll see results. Uh, to another point. One of the problems we face today is that anti-Semitism is applied from the two sides of the aisle. It encroaches on the mainstream from both the radical right and the radical left, and it would have been much easier to address the problem, to address the challenge, if it was from only one direction. And this indeed is the way it used to be. Anti-Semitism was predominantly a problem Jewish communities faced on the part or from the part of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and others. Today, today you have today you have today you have anti-Semitism from the far left, and it's often very difficult. It's often very difficult to discern the far left anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic rhetoric from that of the far right. Sometimes, if you cut and paste, I would find it very hard to tell if the person is a progressive, um, far left intellectual or student or thinker, or if that person is a far right affiliate, because the arguments are rather similar, and the music of the arguments, the music that accompanies the words, is also quite similar. So that's a new challenge, and we'll discuss this challenge in a few minutes. We'll discuss it here with my colleague, Dr. Karl Juncker, who is the project manager of the Anti-Semitism Worldwide Report for 2023, and also the academic director of the Cotler Center. So this will we will reconnect with this specific issue in a few minutes. I think we have to be very cautious in the way we analyze the data, and very rigid in the way we do so. So a few words of definition are perhaps not redundant. When we say anti-Semitic incident, we mean different things. We mean verbal assault, verbal slander. We mean different forms of vandalism. For example, a graffiti drawn on the walls of a synagogue. And we mean different kinds of physical assaults, severe physical assaults, and relatively moderate, but I think equally damaging and frightening physical assaults, such as having an egg thrown at you, and similar incidents. So that's a big variety. Now, I want to be clear. When you read the data, if you don't dive into it, you may understand the thousands of incidents incorrectly. The vast majority of incidents are not physical assaults, let alone severe, grave physical assaults. The vast majority of incidents are verbal assaults and vandalism. So we have to appreciate that, and not be confused. The year today is not 1942. It is not 1939. It is even not 1933. We are not there. But I do want to say a word about why those so-called minor minor assaults are not such that should be understated. The reason being that a reality where you have, on average, this is the case for 2023. On average, in 2023, there were 3 telephone calls a day in the United States with false alarms about false bomb threats in synagogues and Jewish cultural centers. I want you to appreciate that number. On average, 3 false bomb alarms a day across the United States in synagogues and Jewish cultural centers. What you have today in the West is a reality in which public Jewish life is forced to fortify itself. If you want to enter a church, there is no security, at the entrance of the most famous churches. You want to enter a mosque, there is no security. You want to enter a Hindu mosque, Hindu temple, there is no security. You want to enter a synagogue, it's like entering a military base. You want to enter a Jewish school, it's like entering a military base. People are afraid to talk Hebrew on streets, to wear a kippah. Visibly being Jewish, and I emphasize, not visibly being identified as a religious Jew, just being visibly identified as someone who is related to Judaism, has become dangerous, or at least very uncomfortable. When that reaches a certain point, and I cannot tell you where the point is, but when it reaches a certain point, the implication would be not that Jews would not be able to live in the West, but that it would be impossible to lead Jewish lives, whether secular or religious, in Western public spheres. And I'm afraid we are not very far from that point in certain cities, in certain neighborhoods. We have to recognize that, which is why it is so essential to shift from speeches and slogans to more targeted activism. With your permission, a few more points. One of the biggest challenges of our times is to distinguish between criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism, which are obviously legitimate, as are the criticisms of anything else in free societies, and anti-Semitism, which is unacceptable. Now, I have to say, I've given this a lot of thought, and I have to say where I stand at the moment. At the moment, being an Israeli Jew, I have to say I'm not that interested if a person on a so-called Ivy League university campus who calls to eliminate the state of Israel, meaning to eliminate my existence, my family's existence, I'm not that interested whether saying that falls or doesn't fall precisely under the category of anti-Semitism. I'm not really interested if a person who wants to eliminate my existence is an anti-Semite, antipasti. What difference does it make? Someone wants to eliminate me, then what I want to do with that person, I think, is clear and obvious. But if we insist on I don't want to avoid that question. It's a big question. And if we insist that it is important to address it, then I can offer the following formula, which is, I know, somewhat unorthodox. I'll surprise you. Hypothetically, in and of itself, saying that Israel is illegitimate because it is a colonial state is not something I would necessarily define as anti-Semitism. Israel is not a colonial state. Anyone who says that simply does not know the historical facts. But nevertheless, because it's a free society and because we respect different opinions, I'm embracing. So I say this radical thing. Someone saying Israel is an illegitimate state because it's colonial, well, I'm willing to have a dialogue on this. But here's the thing. What I want to know is whether that person who argues that Israel is an illegitimate state because it's a colonial state, because it's a colonialist state, because it's a colonialist enterprise, whether that person also accepts that the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and numerous other states are also illegitimate because they are colonial. Whether that person would do away and would give up with all her or his privileges in the East Coast or the West Coast because of that strong sentiment that colonialism was wrong and cannot be accepted in 2024. Its results cannot be accepted. And if that person doesn't have a very, very clear, unequivocal answer to my very simple question, then I want to know why a distinction is drawn between the United States as a colonialist enterprise and the State of Israel, which, again, I don't think is a colonialist enterprise, but just for the sake of the argument, just for the sake of the debate, I'm willing to accept that. And if there is no good argument why the distinction is drawn between Israel and so many other countries, then I want an explanation why this should not be considered anti-Semitism. What other possible motivation is out there? And if you ever debate Arabs or pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian individuals who invoke this argument, because obviously they don't invoke the argument that this is an endowment, that this is a Muslim land, that doesn't sound right in a Western discourse. So they say Israel is illegitimate because of its colonialist past. Well, then I'd like you to ask them the following question. Here it is. Ask them, are you saying that you're against the existence of the State of Israel because you disapprove of the notion that one people come from one land and take over the land of the people who live there? And they will say, this I can assure you, they will say, absolutely yes. And your comeback should be, then I understand from you, you disapprove of the Muslim occupation of the land of Israel in the 7th century. I've never heard a good comeback to this comeback. So I encourage you to think about this. Two final comments before I give the floor to my colleague Carl, Dr. Juncker, and we'll open it also to your questions. One is, we need to think a little bit about what Israel is doing here. I'm not talking about its policies. Let's be fair to the facts. The daily newspaper of Harvard University published an editorial declaring its joining of the BDS movement a year before the war in Gaza. On the day of the brutal, inhumane crimes against humanity by Hamas in the Negev, on that day before Israel began its defensive operation, on that day, you had 31 student organizations at that university basically blaming Israel for what happened on that day. So let's not fool ourselves. The wave of anti-Semitism we see today is not because Israel is doing something or not doing something. It doesn't help that having said that, it doesn't help that we have a government that, to begin with, has very little international legitimacy and has as a high-ranking member a former, or so he says, disciple of the late racist Rabbi Kahana. That is also the truth. I'm not saying that's the reason why we have such harsh responses with regard to Israel from so many different quarters, including friends, but it doesn't help. What bothers me equally, and to some degree even more, is the total incompetence of our government in dealing with the wave of anti-Semitism we see today, as with so many other issues. This is really incredible. And I'll give you just one example. It may sound as an anecdote, but sometimes from anecdotes, you learn of broader problems. So as you know, this Israeli government not only has 38 ministers, which is arguably a world record, I think, outside the United Kingdom, 38 ministers. It also has, for the first time, a ministry for combating anti-Semitism. It's the Ministry for Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism, a very impressive title. On their webpage, they have a link that urges you, as Jews living in the diaspora, or Jews living outside Israel, to file a complaint or a notification about your exposure to anti-Semitic attacks. Well, we can argue that this is not the most useful or meaningful way of addressing the issue, but nevertheless, they have that link. Well, 6 months ago, I think, Carl, it was 6 months ago, we noticed and noted that the link leads to an empty page. And we made that fact public after the ministry did not respond to our request for some kind of dialogue. We made that public. It was published on a number of media platforms, very respected ones, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. This shocked us. The same link leads to the same empty page. When we published this report on the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day, it was discussed, reported, and given great publicity in hundreds of media platforms in Israel and across the world. And many of them, including the Haaretz, for example, highlighted that the link doesn't work. And then Carl and I were certain that now we'd click on that link and it would lead us to an actual page where you can actually report on an anti-Semitic incident. Well, please give it a try at home. It leads you to an empty page. We have a government that leads to empty pages. You can't fight anything when that is the situation. I think that is almost, I don't want to use words that are too harsh, but that gives me, as a tax-paying citizen, the impression that my money is not well spent, to say the least, because mistakes happen. But when you have a ministry, a homepage of a ministry directed to all Jews in the diaspora, pleading with them to let the government know if they were exposed to anti-Semitism, and for months on, it is unable to provide them with a page where they can actually report, it means that someone is not doing his or her job seriously. And the final word. Look, the situation in Western countries is not easy, but we do also need to recognize the following. Historically, Jews were often unsafe in the West, but it was fascist regime that endangered them mostly. And it was a fascist regime that led to the extermination of 6 million Jews. The place in the world where Jews are currently at the gravest risk, even if they don't recognize it, and even if this is not discussed often, is Russia. And is Russia not only because Russia is a fascist regime today, not any longer an authoritarian one, a fascist regime. And not only because that regime distorts the memory of the Holocaust, abuses the memory of the Holocaust for very cynical reasons. During 2023, we have already began seeing signs of scapegoating Jews, which is often historically what happens when a fascist regime fails. You have the Jews as scapegoats. You have the Jews to kick around. Now, this I'm not saying just as a Zionist. Russian Jews should leave Russia. They're welcome here. But if they want to live to other places, that's of course their choice. They have a homeland here. But that they have the option to do so now does not mean they have that option in 5 years from now. And one of the lessons we learned from history is how important it is to do things on time. So as much as this is a sensitive issue, and as much as no one wants to deal with this trouble, I think at least non-governmental actors should be very clear about this point. Jews have no place in Russia today. They should leave Russia as soon as possible. And a very final word is about, my very final word, we'll have Carl in a second, is about anti-Semitism and the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'll be very brief here because I don't want to test your patience. Here's the thing. Anti-Semitism became an inseparable part of the conflict. In its modern forms, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, Mein Kampf in Arabic, Kifahi, and other anti-Semitic tropes, slander, and so-called classical texts. It was imported to the Arab world in the context of the conflict. It's an importation. As part of the efforts to demonize Jews and Zionists, and also to make sense of the Arab failures. Because if you demonize someone and you have this fictional image of that someone in your head, as if that someone rules the world, controls the world secretly, your defeat as an Arab, your defeat as Arab states, is such that is much more bearable. But here is an important distinction to make. There is no Nazism without anti-Semitism. That is, if you take out the anti-Semitic element from Nazism, it becomes pretty much an empty ideology. But if Hamas was not anti-Semitic, and Hamas is anti-Semitic, even if it was not, it would still be interested in killing each and every Jew living in this land. It being anti-Semitic adds to the scope, the magnitude, the viciousness of the hate and the crimes it commits. But solving the problem of anti-Semitism would not solve the problem of the conflict. So there was a lot of talk after October 7 about the amended Hamas charter, which was not anti-Semitic. And for some people was understood as marking starting a new page in the history of that movement. Well, this is triple-fold wrong. Not a charter, not amended, and still a document that calls for the total destruction of the state of Israel. Not a charter, because that was not how Hamas defined it. It called it a wathika, not a mithaq. You read the document, it is very clear that the ultimate objective is the total elimination and destruction of the state of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. The one thing that is different between that document, which again did not annul the charter is still valid, with its very clear and obvious anti-Semitic rhetoric. But the one thing that is different is that the document, which again is not the charter and is not a new charter, the document is not anti-Semitic. That was a gesture by Hamas for the European Union, the Americans, and maybe some other agents. Hamas does not need anti-Semitism to desire to kill all the Jews. Having said that, I want to emphasize that one lesson that needs to be drawn from October 7 is that in any future diplomatic process, the uprooting of anti-Semitism from Arab textbooks, school books, media, official media, social media, must be presented as a core condition. Because there could never be hope for peace in this region as long as anti-Semitism thrives there. This does not mean that when anti-Semitism is gone, the conflict would be resolved. But the conflict, nevertheless, would never be resolved unless this problem is attended to. Now I'd like to invite for a few minutes Dr. Karl Juncker. If you read the report, he wrote there an excellent analysis of the anti-Semitic discourses in the United States, especially in the American far right, following October 7th. I have to say, I was very surprised and alarmed when I read it, and I want you to also be alarmed. So, Karl, the floor is yours for, I guess, 10, 15 minutes or as much as you need. And we'll address the questions immediately after.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. As Professor Shavit said, I authored an article in this year's report addressing the manifestations of anti-Semitism on the far right after the October 7th attacks. Now, it much attention has been given in American media and media worldwide on the manifestations of anti-Semitism or large anti-Israel demonstrations that have been taking place on campus or that have been manifesting themselves amongst the far left and the far left progressive side of things. But this really highlights a change that Professor Shavit mentioned, that the anti-Semitism of the far left has become much more overt, whereas the anti-Semitism of the far right has always been much more overt, much more out in the open, much more direct. But what we see now is that the fringes of the right and the left are converging on the center and trying to gain control of narratives and gain influence, expand influence on the center in both parties on both sides of the political spectrum. What I want to focus on is the far right specifically. Now, it perhaps goes without saying that neo-Nazis, white nationalists, Christian identity movement, and others are not lovers of Zion or are not lovers of Jews. They're well known to be anti-Semitic, that anti-Semitism forms a part of their ideology, of their belief system, of their worldview. What we saw specifically after October 7th, though, and which I'll speak to shortly, was really shocking and surprising, both in terms of the volume and in terms of the narratives that were advanced. So, just briefly, I want to take you through a few things. One is to talk about how the October 7th attacks, the initial response of those on the far right, like neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and even some Christian nationalists, were to the attacks. I'll mention briefly a few narratives that they tried to push, and then I'll get into this efforts to influence, exert more political influence. So parties on the far right, such as neo-Nazis and white nationalists, welcomed the attack. They were ecstatic, overjoyed that Israel had been attacked, that Jews had been slaughtered. Well-known neo-Nazi, the head of the Goyim Defense League, John Mindanao, in the U.S., was overjoyed, saying, "This is the moment that we've all been waiting for. We should cheer on Hamas, go Hamas, go Hamas." A leader of a neo-Nazi political party that's now been dissolved, the New Jersey Heritage Foundation and the other parties also welcomed the Hamas attack, praising Hamas and urging their followers that if only neo-Nazis and if only white nationalists had such courage to do such a thing, that the white race and our would be in a better position, and we wouldn't be the white nationalists wouldn't be in such a dismal position culturally today. One of the more interesting aspects of this praise and this identification with the Palestinians has been how white nationalists and neo-Nazis have adopted fully the Palestinian narrative, and also kind of worked in far-right symbolism, far-right narratives into the Palestinian nationalist narrative, Hamas narratives, and kind of been joining together with this, the so-called axis of resistance. So Hamas, Hezbollah, other Iranian-backed groups, those opposed to Israel. One example of this is in far-right circles, especially online. There's a meme, a cartoon character called Pepe the Frog. It's a green frog, and if you see it online in message boards and in photos and whatnot, you'll know that there's some sort of far-right messaging going on underneath the surface. And here you saw Pepe the Frog displayed in Palestinian keffiyeh. You saw Pepe the Frog riding a hang glider, and in other sorts of jihadist and Islamist forms, representing this merging of narratives on far-right message boards, on far-right Telegram channels, social media channels. You saw far-right groups taking Hamas propaganda, Palestinian Islamic Jihad propaganda, Hezbollah propaganda, and just copy-pasting and sharing and advancing these narratives, and really promoting this narrative that that Israel is evil, that Israel is slaughtering innocent Palestinians, Israel is committing genocide. Just adopting any narrative that's put out and forwarding it and pushing it as their own. Now, I need to be clear. This is not because white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and others are somehow fond of the Palestinians. They're using this as a means to an end. They see this as a usable issue and a matter that's relevant, through which they can promote their own ideologies, their own neo-Nazi and white nationalist views. Now, some of the main narratives that these groups pushed are I would say two main narratives. One is pushing for a policy change in the United States, and one that promotes a more isolationist foreign policy. So this was manifested online and in protests and demonstrations, demanding that there be no more wars for Israel, that Americans stop going and fighting on behalf of Israel, or that they don't go fight on behalf of Israel, that arms not be shipped to Israel. And this was also tied into Ukraine as well. But these narratives became anti-Semitic and saying that Israel and the Jews are controlling American foreign policy, are influencing American foreign policy, and that maybe this was even a false flag operation to try to get Americans involved, more deeply involved in the Middle East, and lead to their death, to more American deaths. The other main narrative that was pushed is a conspiracy narrative that's gained traction in recent years, called the Great Replacement Theory. This theory posits that Western white societies are being replaced by immigrants. Now, this is there's variations on it in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, but that there's some, usually all this conspiracy comes down to is that there's some force promoting this mass immigration and this mass replacement of white European or American, white American culture. And usually it's left unspoken, but when it is spoken, it usually comes down to the Jews being responsible for this great replacement. And what has happened in this is that one of the reasons why these white nationalists and why these neo-Nazis are supporting the Palestinians is that they view this as an opportunity to not only push back Israel and defeat the Jews, but also hopefully maybe establish an independent Palestinian state and create some stability in the Middle East that will enable Middle Eastern refugees, say from Syria, from Lebanon, from Palestine, and elsewhere, to come back and to leave these Western countries, thereby helping to purify or make American society or German society or Hungarian society more white, more European. These are the main narratives that were pushed. More broadly, within, say, the conservative movement, you have groups of people that are on the far right that have worked now for the last 8 years or so to really mainstream their views, coming on, whether it's views on immigration, views on abortion, on Christian identity, etc. And they have used October 7th to further push their narratives, but also to attack, say, Jewish Republicans, and to attack Republican support now for Israel, which was, conservative support for Israel was kind of viewed as a given, and now they're trying to work to actively undermine that in any way that they can. Now, since October 7th, this report focused just on kind of the first 3 months of this manifestation, and obviously the war now has lasted 8 months. And what we've seen in the first part of 2024 is a continuation of these trends. They've only intensified and increased. White nationalist groups, neo-Nazis, and others are on the far right are not stopping in promoting these narratives. They've intensified them, and they've also tried to co-opt or form alliances even with the far left, or at least attempt to have new recruits from even the far left. There was an example of a demonstration, a pro-Palestinian demonstration in Montana that I wrote about, where the pro-Palestinian demonstrators were walking down the street, and there was a protest, counter-protest or supportive protest on the side from local neo-Nazis and white nationalists. And when the pro-Palestinian protesters saw them, they started saying Nazis go home, fascists go home. And then the Nazis and the fascists, wrote back or said back to them, well, at the end of the day, don't we want the same thing? We're all chanting and asking for Israel to be cleansed of the Jews and Palestine to be free. So there is an effort to try to out people even on the left, or to bring them over to the cause. I want to conclude briefly, just again by highlighting this idea of the fringes moving in on the center. I grew up in northern Colorado, in a town of Fort Collins, and just north of us, about 10 minutes, is a smaller town of LaPorte. And in LaPorte is a small white church, small white building called the LaPorte Church of Christ. And this church has served since the late 1970s as one of the main hubs of the Christian identity movement in the United States. Now, growing up, I always knew that there was this kind of racist, white supremacist Christian identity church about 10 minutes down the road that was led by this pastor, Peter J. Peters. But he was out there. It was 10 minutes away. You never knew if he was ever in town. Unless you searched for his stuff on the radio, you never heard it. It was easy to ignore, easy to never know that he even existed. Today, that's not the case. His messages and messages of others you can find on YouTube, you can find on TikTok, you can find on other social media platforms. Not only that most of these white nationalist groups that you would think are on the fringe or on the side are now flyering, are now doing sticker propaganda across the United States. There's a more visible presence, and this is what's changed. So with that, I will stop, and we will move to our time of question and answer. Thank you very much.
So thank you for staying with us. We don't have that many questions, and I'll address a lot of what we have, and you can see are more of comments, and they are well appreciated. So I'll just address, I think, 2 points that were raised, perhaps more as questions. One, let me clarify. There is always this interesting thing that you talk about something and you say it is not, and then you get a question. So are you saying that it is? No, I said it is not. I meant it. The wave of anti-Semitism in the world today, as I mentioned, is not a direct response to anything any Israeli government did or could or would have done. I was very clear about that. My point about the ministry for combating anti-Semitism was that we have the strange expectation as taxpayers that it would actually work. And when a link so essential, the one that is supposed to be leading to reporting anti-Semitic incidents, is for months on not functioning, leading to an empty page, that leads me to be concerned. I want to know why this is the case. Why is it that people who earn money for doing a certain job are, well, I guess, Carl, we can say evidently not doing it, or maybe it's just our three computers and others we tried that lead to an empty page. We know it's not the case. Please correct that link, amend it. It's really strange. There was a question about whether national programs could work. So I want to say something about this. What makes me a bit, I would say, reserved about national programs is that they can easily lead to broad policies, statements, speeches, rather than to what we at the center think based on our analysis that is really needed, which is, as I mentioned, first addressing the issue of social media through legislation, and not just legislation, through seeing that the legislation is effective, that it is implemented, and identifying those neighborhoods, regions, cities, schools, where you have a lot of the phenomenon, and then doing police work and educational work there with very clear objectives that are set. Having said that, and perhaps so that we end on an optimistic note, what we did in the report in our analysis this year is that we analyzed 2023 as a whole, because that's what we do every year. We take the year as a whole and analyze the incidents that took place between January 1st to end of December. But we also distinguished between the first 9 months of the year and the last 3 months of the year. That is, what was the scope of anti-Semitic incidents up to October 7th and from October 7th. Now, I'm not going to surprise any of you when I mention that we saw a huge increase following the October 7th attack. But something that was very alarming was that in most countries with large numbers of Jews, the first 9 months of 2023 also saw large increases in comparison to the first 9 months of 2022, including the United States. And in some of them, that large increase was the large increase of 2022 was a large increase in comparison to 2021. But there were two countries where that was not the trend. In the first 9 months of 2023, there was a significant decrease in the number of incidents in Germany and in Austria in comparison to 2022. And in Germany, 2022 marked a decrease in comparison to 2021. So the trend was very clear. I think in Austria, the same. What Germany and Austria have in common is a no-nonsense approach to addressing anti-Semitism. You spread hate, you spread anti-Semitic tropes, you're in prison. And B, both countries have national programs to combat anti-Semitism. And it might just be that all of this is indication that those national programs actually work. A final word before we say goodbye is the following. Look, if you draw a linkage between the war and this wave of anti-Semitism, I'd like to remind you, there was no wave of anti-Semitism following the Six-Day War. There wasn't one following the Entebbe raid, and there wasn't one following the bombing of the Iraqi nuclear installations in 1981, June 1981. The truth is, this may sound simplistic, but when Jews and the Jewish state seem weak, you have anti-Semitism. When they seem strong, it's not that you don't have it, but you have much less of it. So perhaps this is something to consider and to think about. I thank you all for attending and for your questions and comments. I think, again, the alumni organization and the Next Gen organization at Tau that hosted us. And let us hope we meet in better times in the near future. Thank you.